Welcome to the What I Wish I Knew After Pregnancy Loss podcast. I am your host, Shana Southern. I am an angel mum, a rainbow mum, a pregnancy loss practitioner, and trauma-informed coach. I created the Institute of Healing Through Pregnancy Loss out of my own experience with loss in the hopes to provide understanding and healing, educating people on pregnancy loss, and creating more women or men in trained support roles. In this podcast, I hope to shed light on what I wish I knew in relation to pregnancy loss, opening up the conversation, breaking the stigma, and bringing real life stories plus guest experts. Thank you for being here with me today, and let's dive into today's episode. Welcome, beautiful souls, to the What I Wish I Knew After Pregnancy Loss podcast. Today, I have with me April Bilodeau. April is a professional equestrian and a freelance writer based in Massachusetts. She found out that she had a miscarriage, and it took her a long time for her body to be able to pass the baby. Thank you for joining us, April.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. Did you want to share a little bit more about your story and, what has led you to where you are today?
Sure. So I found out that I was pregnant June of 2023. Um, and things seemed to be going well. I was still very early stages at kind of the peak of all of this, but Um, I had woken up one morning and had a little bit of blood, and my husband happened to, he never travels for work, but he happened to be traveling for work that day. And so I gave him a call and I just said, hey, I just, this doesn't seem quite right. I'm going to call the doctor, go into the doctor's office and see what's going on. Um, and upon going in, I had an ultrasound. It was my first ultrasound because at this point, I was only about 7 weeks along. Um, I, upon having the ultrasound, they said there's definitely a sac there, but there was no heartbeat. It looked like the sac was maybe more along the 5.5 weeks mark, and basically said not to panic at that point. Um, they sent me in just to speak with a midwife, and we together went over my dates, and she said, um, I would love to be thinking differently on this, but your date seems so accurate that I'm leaning more towards this being a failed pregnancy. Of course, there I was in the doctor's office by myself. It was probably one of the worst feelings I've ever experienced. And she went over the options with me, but at this point, it was a matter of, well, let's just wait for a couple weeks. You'll come back for an ultrasound and we'll see if there's any growth. Um, so the course of those 2 weeks was basically just me waiting. And I knew in my gut, because I don't know, I felt, even though I was quite early, there were little things that I felt and sort of knew, just, I don't know if you want to call it the maternal instinct aspect of things, but I could just feel that there was something there. Um, and after that day, I didn't, I didn't feel that way. And my husband was very positive and was like, you don't panic yet. They told you not to panic yet, and let's just see where this goes. But I knew that at that point I was in for, some bad news. When I went back, sure enough, there was no growth. And at that point, we made the decision to go the medication route of taking the misoprostol and letting the pregnancy pass at home. The reason that we decided to go with that option was because my entire life I had had bad periods. And what I was told was that you'll take this, it'll be like you have a bad period for maybe 24 hours. Actually, really what they said was between 2 and 6 hours, it'll feel like you're having a bad period. And then the blood will slowly taper off over 24 hours. Um, where I had had bad periods my whole life, I didn't think anything of that option. I thought, you know what, I'd rather do this in the comfort of my own home and, just set aside some time and be able to grieve, I guess, with just me and my husband, Emerson. Um, Upon that though, uh it was sort of the start to a very terrible few months. Which sounds dramatic and kind of unbelievable looking back on it, that this was at this point August. And I ended up in the hospital multiple times for excessive bleeding. I needed to have my iron levels monitored because I was at risk of needing a blood transfusion. Um, 2 rounds of misoprostol and DNC later, I still was having issues. Um, in, I believe it was October or November at this point, I had a very, very heavy period that lasted about 14 days. And it was the second period post DNC. And I went into the doctor's office and was prescribed medication to help with the bleeding. But at this point, I, and this is something that was found out during the ultrasound, that I had had a fibroid that it was on the fence of, it seems big enough that we could remove it, but we can't really trace that back to being the cause of your miscarriage. But I think the logic of what had happened was the pregnancy had sort of aggravated the fibroid so much that I just now was excessively bleeding, even, post pregnancy and post miscarriage. And so December, I had my first fibroid removal, and then had to go back in January for another removal, just because the fibroid had actually grown in size so much that it needed 2 procedures to remove it. So not only was it a long journey after pregnancy loss, but it's been a long journey to actually recover from the findings of the likelihood of what all happened here. So it's almost been a year at this point. But it's hopefully looking up from here. But I learned quite a bit in the year. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, when you're going in and they're sort of saying, this is probably like even the choice that you made to take the tablets so that you could go home and you could do it at home, and they're like, you know, 2 to 6 hours of a heavy period.
Mhm.
I remember I didn't take the medication, but when they said to me, oh, it'll just be like a heavy period, I'm like, well, I can do that because, I have heavy periods. If that's all it's going to be, obviously on top of all of the heartache and everything that you're going through, you feel like you could, bear a heavy period. But
Mhm.
then it doesn't turn out that way. Your journey obviously was so prolonged and, you know, traumatic.
Mhm.
I myself ended up in hospital with a lot of blood loss, and ended up having a DNC as well. But it's not anything that I was ever prepared for by the GP. There was nothing to say this could happen. And if this does happen, make sure you get yourself some medical attention. But in your case, like I wonder, in knowing that you had the fibroid, like they could have maybe given you some more information about kind of
Yeah.
how it could all play out. Um, and not only did it sort of prolong your physical healing, it would have prolonged your mental and emotional healing as well, because
Right.
it kind of all stemmed from you finding out that you had lost your baby.
Right. Yeah. And that was the really difficult part, is it was sort of like, there were sort of two aspects of the grieving for me. That, number one, I'm grieving the loss of the baby, which is, heartbreaking on its own. And then I was, simultaneously trying to make sure that I physically was okay. And um like I guess a little bit of grieving of this like former self or life that I had envisioned, that this whole process took over quite a bit of time for me. And I would start to be able to feel like I was healing mentally, and then all of a sudden physically my health would be at a point where it was kind of scary. And that then draws up all of the emotional pain. And so it was sort of this whole chase of, you know, getting better and then having a really, really big low, and then starting to feel like, okay, this is going to be the last time that I have to go to the hospital for this. And then 2 weeks later, there I was again. So it is, I do think that there is and what I've learned from doing a little bit more research and opening up about this a little bit more is that I think that there needs to be a better job done of saying, this is what it should be. However, this is the full array of what it could be. Um, because after, I was calling the hospital pretty regularly saying, hey, I'm still bleeding. Is that normal? And every time it was oh no, this isn't normal at all. And I want you to know your case is unique. And it actually seems like more women experience something irregular than just a heavy period than it was made out to seem for me.
Yeah. I mean, just in general, like the amount of women that I've spoken to as well with, it has turned out to be not just a heavy period.
Yeah.
Um, and that in itself is very traumatic because you sort of get given this information and then you're like, okay, you go home with it and you're like, you kind of prepare yourself for
Hmm.
that to come. Like you wait, it's that whole waiting game, and then you're like, okay, and then you start to bleed, and you're like, okay, this is it, and then it keeps going, and you're like, okay, maybe that was it, and then
Hmm.
it keeps going and it gets worse, um, to the point where then you're like, okay, for me, I actually thought I was going to die, so it was a real case of life or death. Like, no one can bleed this much and survive. And
Hmm.
it wasn't until I sort of started opening up that conversation that I realized that was a lot more women that were going through those same feelings and grieving and in isolation and feeling like, well, this could be normal still. I wonder if
Mm.
this is normal still. And it wasn't until I ended up in hospital, they're like, well, you should have called sooner. And I'm like, but I didn't
Right.
know. And that's
Right.
that when you said I don't know whether it's that they don't want to scare anyone, but you do need to know that, okay, this is what it can be, and this is what we kind of expect it to be, but this is maybe worst case scenario. And if you
Hmm.
do end up heading towards that place, call the hospital or, take yourself up there or do something, because them telling you that it's unique, it
Hmm.
doesn't help you in any way. It just
Right.
it sort of adds that layer of like, oh, well, it's just me. Great.
Right. Right. Well, it's so the day before my scheduled DNC, I ended up going to the hospital early because I was bleeding at a rate that very similar to what you just said, was that the thought in my mind was there's no way I'm going to be able to bleed like this and survive through the night. So we went to the hospital and it was awful. But uh, they said that we could do it now, but we feel confidently that we can keep you stable. We'll check your iron levels. We would rather have you do this with the team that's supposed to be doing this in the morning, and we'll keep you here and we'll monitor you. And that's the route that we went with. But I remember at one point, and I would say before this experience, I would feel so uncomfortable saying this, but I've gotten so comfortable with talking about blood loss at this point, which is it's a terrible thing to say, but it's a little bit part of the piece of this that needs to be spoken about more is that I I remember just laying in the hospital bed. I was totally soaked, and I asked one of the nurses came in at one point, and I was like, "Can you just change something out below me so that I can at least feel dry because I'm just soaking in my own blood right now?" And the reaction was like, "Oh, you should have said something, and I'm, happy to do that." And it's like, "Well, I've been saying that, that's the whole reason I'm here." And, it's again that, it was almost like this was shocking news that I was, in for what I was in for. And it's like, I just need a little bit of comfort here so that I don't feel totally humiliated sitting here. And it is, and there's really no reason to feel humiliated in this situation, but it's like it's it almost feels like degrading to be in that situation and a little bit of like a burden almost that like I couldn't move and I'm just sitting there soaked and granted I don't think there's really anything that could be done to really make the situation better, but I do think that opening up the conversation to the fact that it sounds like you had a very similar situation to me, which means that if you and I had a similar situation, then there's probably many, many others that have, because I don't think it's just you and I, but um, yeah, so
I know.
it's not fun.
No, and I wish that it was just you and I. Like, but I know
Hmm.
for sure it's not. You know, and I think a lot of our hesitation to talk about blood goes back to, talking about our periods and
Hmm.
how there's so much shame around it. Like you can't talk about your periods. You can't talk about the bleeding like once a month. Like, and it's such
Yeah.
a hard conversation to have in general in society. And it's you got to do that in private. You can't let anyone see. So when then you come up against these experiences where you're like, oh my gosh, there is like excessive amounts of blood, like coming from, and again, it brings up all of that, silence and shame. And you're like, oh, I can't talk about blood coming from that area of my body.
Sure.
Um, but I remember for myself being in the hospital, they put me in a adult diaper. They were like, we need to obviously monitor all of the blood that is coming out,
Hmm.
and make sure that, we can stay on top of it. But within a couple of hours, they had me in for a D&C because they were saying to me my body wasn't going to actually stop the process on its own. Like I was just
Hmm.
going to continue to lose blood.
Yeah.
Um, and it's a very real thing. And I think we absolutely do need to talk about those experiences as part of the process in pregnancy loss, and the fact that we can also, I experienced contractions as well. And I was only, I guess, 2 weeks further along than yourself. And
Hmm.
told me I shouldn't have been experiencing contractions. So they're like,
Yeah.
no, no, this can't be right. You would have had to have been at least 10 weeks along. And I'm like, but they measured it at 7 weeks. I don't know what else to tell you, but this is
Right.
what I'm experiencing. And it wasn't until the
Yeah.
hospital that they validated that experience. They're like, you're actually going through
Mhm.
contractions. We can see it.
Wow.
Um, so again, it's information that they don't willingly give you, um,
Right.
which just compounds into the fact that you feel so ill prepared. Not that you're ever going to be prepared, but even more so
Hmm.
ill prepared
Hmm.
for what's actually what's happening to your body.
Right.
Um, and then for yourself, like to find out that you've then had to go through multiple surgeries, and
Hmm.
multiple, extra things for your body to have to heal and go through. Um, after your loss as well.
Mhm.
How were you able to, I guess, support yourself through that? Because it was such a long period where you said, your mental health and your physical health were kind of both like dipping and waning, and there was highs and
Mhm.
lows. Um, was there, like, how were you able to sort of support yourself through that?
So, a few things, and the first one I would say is, I'm going to say this and then explain, but in a way, I had to stop caring what it looked like. Um, especially in my job, I have a pretty physical job. It's primarily in, my own backyard. We own a farm, so it's, people come here for lessons and they board their horses here. And so a hard piece of it for me was trying to keep this aspect of my life private while also having a full-blown business right outside my door. And it got to a point where I had to, number one, say that I didn't really owe it to anybody to explain anything that was going on right now. And then the other half was that I had to not care if I had to leave a lesson to, to go change because I had bled through my pants, or like little things like that, that I just had to have this sort of mental shift of prioritizing myself and, making sure that everything else ran smoothly from the background. But, for my surgeries, taking days off and just saying, I'm not available. Here's the options, but I'm not available and I need to take care of myself. And that was a very hard thing for me to do. And I think it's a hard thing for a lot of women to do. That um, I think we're all super women to some extent, and to have to learn to put things on pause so that we can properly support and take care of ourselves, no matter what the circumstances. It's a hard thing to do, but it's a mandatory thing, especially in a situation like that. Um, and, I think the other thing for me was opening up more to it, to in areas that I felt comfortable. I know I mentioned that, keeping my business life and my private life was important to me. Um, but being able to talk about it with family and friends a little bit more, and importantly, on my terms, because I think that sometimes it's I guess it's a little bit of a catch-22, that you want to open up and talk about something, but then it gets to the point where talking about it too much, you get a little bit dizzy and a little bit like, okay, like I'm done with the conversation. I'm done reliving that piece of it. And so finding ways to open up about it and to I guess honor that piece of my life in that moment, while also knowing how to navigate those conversations so it didn't become um you know a a spot of, starting to feel sick over it, if that makes sense. um so really just finding different ways to, you know open myself up to healing, both, um you know as a little bit of an introvert and an extrovert. And the other thing too is, my husband's been wonderful through all of it, and whatever I've needed, he's been able to help and take care of. But I also want to note there too that it's a very different experience for the loss that he experienced and the loss that I experienced. And that's a whole other piece to be able to emotionally navigate. That certain things for me, I feel a little bit more because it was something that I felt, you know, being, being a mom for those 7 weeks, we'll call it, was, like I said at the beginning, it was something that I felt, I saw these slight little changes in my bodies. I felt little changes in my bodies. And it's crazy to say, because I don't think, maybe this is another thing that they don't talk about enough, but I don't think that, or I never thought that early on you would feel those little things. but I can honestly say that I did. And that's not something that, you know, that's not something that he felt. And so, which of course he didn't, but you know, it's just navigating that piece of it too is a is unique that, you know, there's certainly as a couple, there are things that you experience and go through together. He was sleeping on a chair next to me that overnight in the hospital. But he wasn't the one that was actually experiencing that physical loss. And so learning to navigate that and voice how I was feeling was also you know, a way to support myself and, you know, help him to understand what I was going through.
One in 4 pregnancies will result in miscarriage. 1 in 8 women will experience infertility. 1 in 100 women will experience recurrent miscarriage. And 1 in 160 births end in stillbirth. Have you been wanting to make a difference in the lives of women or men who have experienced pregnancy loss because you can see so many suffering in silence, but you just don't know how? Collectively, we can change how bereaved parents can access mental, physical, and emotional support after their experience. There is a lot of women with unhealed trauma, and there is a huge gap in the current support system when it comes to bereaved parents' recovery after loss. There are too many women and men suffering in silence. The Pregnancy Loss Practitioner Certification is a worldwide, one-of-a-kind program that gives you proven methods designed for healthcare professionals, medical staff, midwives, nurses, doulas, birth workers, coaches, and angel parents alike. The Pregnancy Loss Practitioner Certification is bridging that gap. It will give you a proven support structure to follow and education specific to pregnancy loss, created by a loss mum. It is creating more education specifically for loss so that you can enhance your service and become the point of difference. Or you can create the support that you so desperately needed in your healing after loss. This is the next level of growth and expansion you have been searching for. So does this sound like something that you have been searching for? Let's explore this more together. You can head to the episode show notes where you'll find the program application, or direct message me on Instagram and let's open up the conversation in how you can use this education. You have a gift, and I look forward to supporting you and witnessing you bring your gift to the world, healing and transforming women's lives. It is a hard place to navigate, isn't it? Like that the life after loss. You end up sort of being thrust into a new world, and one where you do have to start trying to advocate for yourself more, and tell
Mhm.
people what it is that you need, because unfortunately I found people weren't mind readers. They didn't know what I need unless I told them. And sometimes
Sure.
you don't know what you need, especially in those early moments of grief and, the pain. Like, you don't actually know what you need, but you know you want something. Um,
Yeah.
it is, and starting to understand what those boundaries are for yourself, um, where those boundaries lie and what your capability is in that, within that. And when
Hmm.
you've hit that line, you're like, no, okay, that's it. I've got to take a step back. I can't do any more. And showing
Right.
yourself that compassion, because it is very important, especially, in these moments, because people either, yeah, may not talk about it and you want them to, and you want to be able
Hmm.
to, ask for things, or they may be, you know, at your doorstep wanting to help you, which is great, but also
Hmm.
you might want space. So
Right.
how you navigate that, you're like, no, I need time right now, but I might need you later.
Right.
Um, and absolutely, like you said, with the partners, the husbands, like they do. My husband was there holding my hand with me when I was in the hospital, but he also witnessed everything that happened at home. Like I ended up
Mm-hmm.
telling him, don't go to the bathroom because I physically can't clean up in there and there's blood everywhere. I'm like, just don't go there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, and he was Googling everything. He's like, how long is this going to last? Like, what can I do to help you? And I
Yeah.
remember him telling me that the bleeding could last 10 days. That's what Google said. And I was like, I will die. Absolutely, I will die if this is going to last 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
That was my initial thought because I was like, I was a day, or I think it was a day in, and I was like, I can't, nope, no, I can't do this for 10 days.
Yeah.
Um, and then he was holding my hand at the hospital, like right up until they took me in for surgery. So, like you said, like
Mm-hmm.
they're not physically feeling it, but they're witnessing everything and
Right.
feeling so helpless in all of it too. Like they can't
Mm-hmm.
take the pain away for you. They can't stop anything that's happening. And then they feel so helpless.
Yeah.
Um, and then afraid. Like my husband didn't tell me how scared he was until a year after our loss.
Yeah.
So, it is a very hard place to also find middle ground when you're trying to navigate yourself and also understand that they're navigating it as well, but it just looks so different.
Right.
Um, and then you assume that you both should be feeling the same things, but you're not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's it's a whole new world. Like, and it adds a new layer to that whole communication piece, especially when you're in that relationship, because you're like, you need to talk about it. You need to see where each other's at so that you can help
Right.
each other.
Right. Yeah.
Um, is there anything else that you wanted to share essentially around, what we've been talking about? Is there anything that you wanted to, elaborate on in particular? Um, but I know we've covered a
Yeah.
lot today.
We have. We have. We have. I think that one thing that I think about often on the subject of resources and um, the just the beginning of the experience alone is that, and granted, I'm taking just one experience, and maybe this isn't everyone's experience, but um, you know, from the standpoint of uh, finding out that I had a loss, um, I think that when you're speaking to whatever the professional is in your situation, it's hard to really retain anything that's being said to you as far as what to expect, your options, anything like that. And I think I got a couple of sheets of paper, but it wasn't a matter of here's a brochure on this and a brochure on that, and what to there's I didn't receive anything like that I know would have been really helpful to. And we talked about knowing the array of how these things can play out and understanding that. But one other thing that I really noticed was I every single one of my appointments, which I think I ended up going in. This was, aside from surgeries and emergency visits, I was probably in the gynecology office or obstetrics office, um, probably 6 or 7 times. And there was nothing more painful for me than sitting in that waiting room and watching women come in and out with, you know, full bellies and ultrasounds and that piece of it. And, I'm sure it's not something that anybody really looks at, but I personally have thought a lot about the patient experience in all of this. And, not only do we as women experiencing this horrible tragedy, not only do we need more resources, but we need a little bit more thoughtfulness in this because, you know, from the first time I sat there in my gut knowing that something was wrong to the last time where I sort of developed a sense of humor about it because I didn't know how else to cope. That it was like, well, here I am still bleeding and, there they are, probably a couple weeks from having a baby. And, I just I my wish is that, we can continue to open up this conversation so that people, including medical professionals, start to look at this in a different way to better support us and think about the things that could potentially be triggering or upsetting, like sitting in a lobby and watching that traffic come and go.
And you're not alone. There is so many women that have had that experience too, and having to sit with pregnant women knowing, what their experience has been. And it's funny you say that because I was just talking to one of my students recently, and that was her experience too. But she's since been aware of a, a obstetrician gynecologist office somewhere in the States that has, she said there's only one that has an exit and entry point for women who have had pregnancy loss. And I'm just like, whoever that doctor is
Mhm.
that saw that need, I take my hat off to him or her. I don't
Mhm.
even know,
Mhm.
because that's what we need. That's what women need. They don't need to be sitting in a waiting room full of pregnant women being triggered by that sight, knowing what their experience is, or have someone sitting across from them in that same waiting room going, oh, how long, how far along are you? And then you
Mhm.
have to then explain your why you're there.
Right.
Um, so there absolutely needs to be, like you said, a shift in the way that, women are shown understanding and support from the medical system as well, and in just that one small change without, not having to have women sitting in the same waiting room as
Right.
other pregnant women. And like you just said, watching them come and go, knowing that, they have that possibility of having their baby, which is what you wanted so much. And that's why you wished you would be sitting there with
Right.
that same outcome, but you're not. And it's such a triggering experience. Um, just one more question before we wrap up. So,
Yes.
what do you wish you knew after experiencing pregnancy loss?
Um, I wish I knew that it was far more common than I think I realized. Um, I think it depends on who you ask or where you Google, but sometimes it's 1 in 4, sometimes it's 1 in 6. So I guess law of averages will say 1 in 5. Um, but I wish I knew that it was more common, and I wish I knew that it wasn't just, I think in my mind it was just, when you lose a baby, it's just, oh, the baby's not there anymore. And that's, probably a pretty naive way to look at it. But I think that's just, there's sort of this whole culture that doesn't, and I feel like a broken record saying it, but just doesn't talk about it. But that's really what it is. And, um, I recently wrote an article about my experience. Our due date was March 1st, so we just passed what would have been our baby's birthday. And I wrote this piece in an effort to reach everybody who has experienced this type of loss. And it was overwhelming to see the amount of women that commented and said, I understand this, or, I'm sorry that you also went through this experience. And, I think that the more we can open up and talk about our experiences and, and really normalize it, because I think that I felt a bit of shame coming into this that I no longer feel, because in fact, again, going back to that 1 in 5, 20% of pregnancies end up here. And so, if you've experienced loss, if you're currently experiencing loss, there's nothing wrong with you. It's normal, and there's many women like you.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with everything that you just said.
Yeah.
So if someone wants to reach out and connect with you, where can they find you?
Instagram is probably the best spot. It's at April Bilodeau, and I think an underscore there. But and I think I'm there too. You can email me, and I do. I had a couple from that article, a couple totally random women reach out to me as well, and that's my hope with all of this. And I want to thank you too, because of course I found my way to you and the podcast just from, I think I just typed in Instagram miscarriage, and resources came up, and women like yourself that have the same mission, that we just need to open up the conversation and talk about it. So I hope that I too, you're kind of a role model for me in that regard. So I do hope that, if you're listening to this and would like to reach out, please do.
You're so beautiful. Thank you.
Of course. Of course.
And I'm so glad that you did find me. The universe obviously allowed us to cross paths, and you're here today. We've had a few conversations prior, but you're here today. And the way that you want to share your experience and open up the conversation is beautiful. So I do hope that, and I know that by you even just writing that article, you are going to be helping, multitudes of women feel less alone in their story, even if they don't reach out. But absolutely, if you do want to reach out and you do want to continue the conversation with April, find her on Instagram, and I'll make sure that I pop her details in the show notes so you can find her. But thank you so much, April, for being a part of the What I Wish I Knew After Pregnancy Loss podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. Thank you for sharing so openly and vulnerably.
Of course.
Thank you to all that have listened in. If this episode was valuable to you, I invite you to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and I look forward to supporting you on the next episode. Thank you for listening in with me today. I hope you found this episode helpful. If you did, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Take a screenshot of this episode, share it to social media, and tag me at Institute of Healing_PL. I love seeing what is resonating with you right now. If you want to chat further, I invite you to connect with me through Instagram. Head over and follow my Instagram account, send me a DM, and let's open the communication. If you want to know more about how you can be the support for others, head to the show notes and fill out the application form for the Pregnancy Loss Practitioner certification. I want to also note here that what I share within the episodes is not medical advice. If you need further support, please consult your doctor. Thank you again. Much love to you. Be gentle with yourself, and I look forward to supporting you on the next episode.